So I think at that point I should say welcome. Welcome to the Sci Business School. My name's Sue Dobson. I'm a professor here and serve as the Deputy Dean of the Business School. It's lovely to see you all today. This is the second of our series of conversations about gender and diversity and equality. This series has been supported by the Oxford Wellcome Institutional Strategic Support Fund. Part of that work is the seminars, but also part of it is some research that we're doing on diversity. Helen, wherever Helen is, Helen's there, and Mahima and myself are working on that project. So it's supporting and feeding into these seminars. So our second speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Sir Martin Donnelly. Sir Martin was appointed President of Boeing Europe and Managing Director of Boeing UK and Ireland in June 2019. He is responsible for expanding Boeing's presence and pursuing new growth and productivity opportunities as a senior representative in Europe, the UK and Ireland. So he's based in Boeing UK, but is also reports to Sir Michael Arthur, President of Boeing International. Before joining Boeing, Sir Martin spent more than 3 decades in government service in the UK and 2 years as a senior business advisor and lecturer. He was Permanent Secretary to the Department for International Trade from 2016 to 17, and before that he spent 6 years as Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And throughout his civil service career, Sir Martin was mindful that the civil service must open up new ways of thinking and working. And when at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, he set ambitious targets for the department. And in November 2014, it was announced that 50% of its senior leaders were women for the first time. In addition to his present role, Sir Martin is a trustee at the Oxford Centre of Islamic Studies, a board member at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, and a trustee at the Gingerbread Single Parent Family Charity. And it's with an incredible great pleasure and thanks that we ask you to give our second lecture, Gender Diversity, How Far We've Progressed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. It's a real privilege to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. This evening, I will be speaking about gender, and I know women is not an unproblematic term, and many now see gender as a non-binary category. So, to be clear, I will be talking about the social experience of women in the sense of those who identify as women, and the impact of society on them. And I called the talk, How Far Have We Progressed? But really, thinking about this, I wondered why we're here. And I want to divide this talk a little bit into 2 sections, because I think both are relevant to this subject. I mean, the first one is, well, why are we still talking about this? Why do we still have headlines like these? And are there any people called David or Steve in the room, by the way? You don't have to own up, but the rest of us, want to know who you are. It's very strange, because this isn't an intellectual conundrum that we're dealing with. And I just refer to 2 books, if my clicker allows, yes, which I would simply, say anybody who needs to remind themselves of the arguments as to why gender and other forms of diversity produce more efficient, effective, innovative organizations. Well, Iris Bonnet from Harvard, just set them all out. And also what you have to do to get there. It's a very good, clear summary of all the things we know work to get to more diverse organizations. And of course, it's not the only book, but it's relatively recent. And I found it a very helpful summary. The other one, and I don't know, have many people read Cordelia Fine's book? Well, I recommend it, because if you don't laugh at some point while reading it, you're probably dead. It's a very witty and amusing, as well as rigorous, look at some of the myths which have stopped us from getting to effective gender and other forms of diversity. And so in preparing to speak to you this evening, I tried to work out what some of those are, and I want to just look at them briefly before talking a bit about my own experience of managing, struggling with these issues. But I think we can't separate why is it so difficult from, well, what are the problems? So I think there are broadly three, and you may want to reflect on this yourselves. First one is essentially, let's see, this is a non-existent problem. Why is it non-existent? Well, it wouldn't exist if everyone behaved like a man. Now, there's the odd wry smile in the room, but I think you recognise that, and I recognise from my professional experience over many decades, that there are people who start from the position, well, this system's been fine, I've got to where I am, naturally I am a talented individual and I've got here through my own efforts, so really, whatever is right. The current system is transparent, supported by all men, efficient and basically fair. Now, empirically, none of those statements are true, but there are people who, while they might not put it quite so bluntly as that, basically buy into that. And it, I think, descends down into the idea that people, men, have natural leadership qualities, tough, decisive, negotiators, dealing with crises, dynamic, can handle stress, assertive. By the way, all of those are terms which feature in job adverts and put one gender off. You can guess which one. And as someone said to me fairly recently when I was looking for job opportunities, this is a job where you eat what you kill. And, fine. And of course, there are other forms of jobs and job adverts, which include terms like supportive, empathic, team working, part-time, flexible, good with people. And you might think which gender those tend to be aimed at. So, one of the problems is people just think, okay, all you have to do is be like me, and there won't be a problem. Then there's a second, I think, slightly less unsophisticated variant of this, which is, women are different. And, they are less good at behaving like a man. And, again, wry smiles, but if we don't recognise there are people out there in positions of authority who do buy into this, we are not going to be able to change it. And this gets a bit complicated because, of course, there are differences between women and men. This is where I have found, though, that the fine book which I referred to earlier is very helpful. There are differences, but if you look at the brain, brains of men and women overlap massively. There are individual differences, they vary in magnitude, but there is a respectable set of neurobiological evidences that show that the differences that do exist are as much there to iron out differences in behaviour as to cause them. And that some of the nonsense that we read about testosterone and so on is simply that. It's nonsense. And that actually, if you look at hormonal differences, they are as much caused by high status in everything from fish to primates as they are as they lead to high status. So, how do we produce the outcomes that we have? Well, I'll give you one quote from the Professor Fine book. She says, "We inherit gender constructions as an obligatory part of our developmental system as we grow up. Gender stereotypes, roles, norms, hierarchies are passed on via parents and peers and teachers and clothing and language and media and role models and organisation and schools and institutions and social inequalities and, of course, toys." And there's some very interesting empirical work about what sort of toys small children play with at different ages and when they start learning what their peers are playing with and decide that's where they want to go, because we're very strongly influenced from basically infancy by peer group behaviour. So we have this issue that we create gender norms and then we claim that people behave in different ways. And I'll just give you one example. In the civil service, private office jobs, supporting ministers, dealing with crises, managing the sharp end between politics and government and deadlines and money and so on. When I was a young civil servant, those jobs were done by men and they were done by women who behaved like men. They were not done by women with small children. And I'm ashamed to say that 30-odd years ago, when I was a man whose wife was having a small child, I was, of course, in the hospital for the birth, and then I went straight back to the office. And nobody in the office thought that was strange. It took 25 years on when we had a principal private secretary in the department that I was permanent secretary of, who had several small children. And she went home in the evening and her deputy took over. And that was absolutely fine. But it would not have been considered acceptable or possible 20 years before, because that wasn't how we did things. There were ways of doing things which suited men who worked in a certain way and did not suit women or indeed other men who worked in a different way. And it wasn't until we tested those boundaries and changed the definition of the job that we discovered, oh, actually they can be done by women and men in different ways. So the question is, why did we not discover that before? So we know that, right. But where do we go from there? Well, the third problem is people who say, okay, but it's a lot better than it was. I mean, you know, when I was a lad, or indeed a young woman, and then you can fill in the anecdotes for yourself. So frankly, and again, you know, we've got to accept that whether it's issues such as pay, there is still a gender pay gap in this country of, you know, 15 to 20% on average, slightly more in some cases. There's also a problem, as Sue knows so well, in areas where women do actually become broadly equal at senior levels. In the health service, we find those are the areas where relative pay is lower than the areas which are still dominated by one gender, which isn't women. So, you know, why is this? What do we do about it? Where are we going? Well, my conclusion is quite simply this, that gender and other diversity issues are really about culture, workplace and societal. And it's not just about top jobs, because you can have what I call the cappuccino culture. You want to look at your board, you want to look at the people who count in public surveys. You bring in some women, or indeed some minorities. But unless you've got a culture which produces a system where people from a range of backgrounds want to do those jobs, you will find it doesn't work. That after a few years, it has reverted. Because until you change the culture, until you have a system where women are at every stage of their career given equal opportunities to move up, you don't have effective gender diversity. You've just fiddled the figures. And that requires looking at our culture of leadership, of work, of why it matters, of how we reward people, and how are we going to do things differently to get a different conclusion. And that, in turn, I think, raises this issue. How tolerant are we going to be in our organisations of behaviours that are not inclusive? Because, you know, in every organisation I've worked in, most people wanted to do the right thing. They didn't always know what it was, and sometimes they thought it wasn't possible for reasons that proved not to be correct when you really tested them. But in every organisation I've worked in, there's also been people who think, well, that's all fine, you know, all this nice, inclusive, let's smile at each other, go off on team building exercises, but, you know, I'm very good at making money. I'm very good at giving ministers what they want. You know, I'm tough and decisive and clever, and if I shout at you, well, that's probably your fault. And frankly, you know, I'm the one who's going to get to the top. And almost every organisation that I have worked in until recently has tolerated that. And as soon as you tolerate that, you give an extremely clear signal that there are two ways to the top. And that the really successful people don't have to follow the same rules as everybody else. And it's not until you challenge that that you actually make progress. So I want to talk a little bit now about how we challenged this in one of my jobs, which was the one I was in for 6 years, running the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. And I've written this up a little bit in an article in McKinsey's Quarterly, which came out about 5 years ago. But essentially, we started in a situation where I took over as the permanent secretary of this department and was told literally on day one, you now have to make 30% cuts to the organisation because this was 2010 and we were in austerity. So I thought, right, we will make them quickly and transparently so everybody knows where they are, and so we minimise the period of uncertainty for everybody. And we made people reapply for their jobs. I just applied for my job. I made sure that all of the senior managers had to do the same, and then the junior managers and everybody else. And we had a tough 3 months, after which we told people what their position was. And we had another tough 3 months, after which everybody knew what their new job would be. And that took us from January to June. And then in the September, I had an away day with the top sort of 170 odd managers in the organisation, and we were going to do some separate management training. And I did one of those. Well, we had a tough time, but you know, now we're moving on to the sunlit uplands sort of speech because I didn't know any better. And we went off to have a little senior group meeting, and there was a knock on the door, and 4 of the more junior managers came in and said, "We want you downstairs. We're not happy, and we're just not buying into this." And that was the rest of the day ripped up, including any chance of having any lunch, incidentally, because I had to deal with a really angry room of people, every one of whom felt they were a victim. They all felt this had been done to them. And it was my wake-up call. We called it later the away day from hell, because it was really. And I realised that, you know, in Victorian terms, yeah, the operation to reduce the organisation had been successful, but the patient had basically died. And the only way out of this was to go back and say to people, okay, what do you really want to do? How do we have to change the culture? We don't know. I certainly don't know. So go away and tell us. And we started the process of coming up with ideas, you know, from the bottom up. We had all the groups you'd expect, and we wrote them up on the walls, and we had 57, and we managed to implement 54 of them. And we started to recreate a culture that people had a minimal confidence in. And then we looked at our values, and we had to be clear on what those were. And you know, I won't bother telling you the ones we came up with, because you can guess about inclusivity and team working and so on. But that's all very well. But how far were people really buying into it? And after a year or two, I thought we got to a stage where we were okay, but we weren't getting any further than that. And I realised that people still didn't trust us, or indeed me, as a leader. And I started sitting down with small groups of people, initially just with women, to find out why and what they wanted and why that wasn't working. And it only worked if I talked about me personally, and I realised that this vulnerability thing was a key part of leadership. But it wasn't just about leadership, and it wasn't really about me. It was about being personal and getting people to know you so they could trust you, and then they could talk about what they wanted. And they started to do that. And some of it was very moving, and some of it was about issues like one relatively young leader saying, I'm sick of being the person who's expected to stay late in the evenings because, yeah, I'm a woman, I don't have a family, and other people do, so they think I can stay at work late. But I've got hockey practice twice a week. I'm a good hockey player, and I expect to get to my training sessions. And I thought, yeah, but you hadn't told us. And you didn't tell us because you didn't expect anything to be done about it. At the other side, there were people who were saying, I've got quite serious caring responsibilities, and these are going to get more difficult over time. And I thought, yes, so you're going to need special flexibility. But you hadn't told us because you didn't trust us to do anything about it. So as we built levels of trust, we were able to build a culture in which people felt that they might want to stay in the organisation and actually be promoted because we were prepared to be flexible about how they worked. And we had job shares. And we had job shares not of the sort where you have a job share, but really, you can't do a serious policy job with deadlines and crises and stress. We put people into jobs that had been like that, but they did them differently. And we had part-time working, not of the sort, I'm afraid I've also seen, where you can work 4 days a week as long as you do 5 days work and nobody notices. And we had role models of these behaviours at senior levels. And then the challenge was bringing in people into an organisation where they felt they could be themselves with their personal lives. So we brought in examples of people. We called it Have Your Cake and Eat It sessions, where mostly women and a few men, including me, would talk honestly about what it had been like to be a woman, perhaps with a family, perhaps with caring responsibilities, perhaps just in a massively sexist organisation, and all the challenges they faced, including a politician. And that worked very well, apart from on one occasion where we got someone in who said, well, basically the way you do it is you have several nannies, and I found if I got up at 5 and I worked for 2 hours before the first nanny arrived, and I could see people thinking, oh dear, this is not how we do things here. But it did help us to understand the trade-offs and challenges people had faced because managers had been complacent, uninterested, or frankly hostile. And as we started to make practical changes to our culture, to make a culture where people did feel at home, and we could encourage people to apply for jobs they hadn't thought they wanted to do because they just thought, this is too much hassle, too much stress, too unforgiving on the rest of my life. We found that actually the combination of making supportive changes, of offering people genuinely flexible working arrangements, of giving them mentors, of showing that this was a team-based organisation, meant that people did want to take the risk of going into more high-profile jobs. But it also led to some challenges externally. I remember when we tried to appoint the first small woman with a regional accent to a job that had always been done by tall men with a treasury background. It wasn't the business community who were worried about this, it was some of my civil service colleagues who wanted to give her an extra interview to check that she could do it. Which of course she could, and she did extremely well. Or the first time that we had a job share, it wasn't at senior levels, it wasn't ministers who caused the problem, it was other people across the wider hierarchy saying, but we've never done that before. Is it going to work? And then we had to have a culture where I remember one senior woman dealing very effectively with a crisis said to me, Martin, I'm going to have to stop doing this for 3 months because one of my children's coming up to the 11 plus, getting a bit nervous, I'm going to have to go home early, to do a little bit more support. I said, of course you are. So, this person will do it. And I went to the minister and said, X isn't going to be doing this crisis anymore for a bit. Y is. And he said, yeah, but X was very good. And I said, yeah, and Y is very good too. Oh, all right then, he said. And that was fine. But the point was we were prepared to do it. Usually that had not happened. And we'd had to build a culture of trust so that people could feel that, what life throws at us was part of a successful organisation, and we helped each other. Which sounds a bit naff, but it isn't, because the deal was nobody came into the organisation who was not prepared to follow the right behaviours, and those included talking to people about who they really were, not who they pretended to be. And I just had to say to people when they arrived, this is how we do things here. And we are intolerant of the wrong behaviours, so don't think you can do them here. And that was difficult. I remember one woman joining us from another organisation which had been male-dominated, where she'd had to shout at people down the phone to get things done. And when she started behaving like that, people at first thought she was joking, because we'd stopped doing that years ago. But it was very hard for her to unlearn the behaviours which had got her into that position. So, of course it wasn't perfect, and of course we had challenges, but people were committed to this. And we ended up having what we thought of as the away day from heaven, or whichever term you want to use, 4 years after the previous one, where several of us talked about, who we really were and the problems we'd really faced. And I talked about some bullying I'd come across as a quite senior manager, which of me, as well as other people, which had led all the women in the team to leave, and me to look out for another job, because I didn't trust the organisation to do anything about it. And I wasn't proud of that, because, it was my job to try and sort it out. But I was ready to share that. And we had a wonderful person who joined from another organisation saying she'd done a job which she felt so ashamed of, she'd pretended when people dropped her off outside the door that she worked in the Pret down the road, rather than in the particular organisation I'm not going to name. And we also had people in to help us with storytelling, because we realised that if you don't tell the story about why your job matters, why your team matters, well, why should anybody think it does? And we worked on that with a consultancy who gave us some free support, but also in teams. And we practiced talking about why these things mattered to us and why our values were important. And we also all did some training for several days, which in many cases involved some work with RADA, and I declare an interest now being on the board there. But when people have got their shoes off and a cork in their mouth, it's actually quite difficult to be pompous or to maintain the barriers that you had before. And this helped people to connect with each other, and importantly, to give each other feedback. So, I might say to Sue, that was a really good presentation, Sue, but you crossed your legs at the end, or you started shuffling around a little bit. And actually, remember to stay grounded. And we could do that because we were a supportive environment. And that meant that we could all get better without point scoring, or without worrying that, you were going to do better than me at the end of year. Because we had, after several years, persuaded the organisation that if you did not follow the behaviours, however brilliantly you had done X or Y, you were not going to do well. There was no trade-off. But we had to show people that that was actually applied to everybody, including all of us at the most senior level, without exception, because I knew that you just needed one exception and the balloon was burst. And everybody just went back to thinking, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? So we got to the stage where half the organisation was made up of women at all levels, and where everybody, including the men, felt much more comfortable working in this environment, which I called high performing. But I'm going to stop with a final point, which was, and then I'm going to give you my last slide, which was this. Life is life is never a little bubble, professionally or personally. And I found it was difficult to get some of the very high-performing people in my organisation promoted elsewhere, because people would say, well, you say X is very good, but what crises has she sorted out? And I say, but she stops crises arising. That's how she... No, that's not the definition of leadership that we use. Or they'd say, but we haven't seen anything of why. And I'd say, yes, that's because she's working 4 days a week. So all her time goes into managing these really difficult issues that she's managing. But you know, if you haven't been known around the place, how does that work? So there's a wider challenge, and that continues. But I know that you can run a gender-inclusive, high-performing organisation. And I also know that the key behaviours that you have to look for are essentially those of being intolerant of what you know are the wrong behaviours. And finally, gender equality is part of wider inclusion. So it's worth the effort. It's not just about gender, it's about minority issues as well. But let's remember that gender is not a minority issue, and people who start from that position are going to get it wrong. Don't expect the next bit to be easy, though. I'll leave you with a quote from one of my team members who had a very high level of emotional intelligence. She said to me, Martin, you know, I'll know we've got there when as many mediocre women are being promoted as mediocre men. On that note, I will stop and pass over to discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so we've got about half an hour now for questions on that very interesting, thoughtful talk. If you're going to ask a question, could you say who you are and where you're from? That would just be very helpful. Thank you, please.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. I think a lot of the things you spoke about, especially things around, you know, systemic opportunities and conversations really matter. I think that's the key thing. People need to learn to talk about the issues around gender and diversity. My question is around that middle management freeze and how, if there are strategies you can share in terms of empowering those middle management leaders to take a chance on people. So I think it goes to what you said at the end of your talk there around, we don't know this person. What does sponsorship mean to you as a leader, and how does that work in practice in Boeing? And sorry, my second question is, do you feel that technology can have some sort of impact on this culture debate? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great questions. Second one, no. Basically, I think technology is fine but irrelevant to the values issues we're talking about here. On the first one, this is really important. I learnt through experience that high-performing teams are diverse, but they're also more difficult to manage than low-performing teams where everybody's the same. Therefore, you have to actively work to identify people you think are going to fill the necessary niches. And there was one point where in the business department we had the only ethnic minority woman director general, who was very good. And she was someone I had seen and I thought, excellent. And we wanted to develop. And when we had temporary promotion positions, we would use those to bring on people whose background and skills and experience we did not have. And the deal was, you know, look, if you're, a Harvard lawyer on the team, fine. But if someone else comes along and is a Harvard lawyer, well, we've already got one of those. So, other things being equal, effective teamwork requires diversity. And if everybody understands that, they think it's fair. If they don't, then there's a risk people think that they are being promoted for the wrong reasons. And I would always say to people we were promoting, whether they were women or had minority traits or simply came from very different backgrounds, I'm really pleased you're doing this job because we are short of role models and we need role models. But that's not why you got the job. You got the job because you were the best person for the job, and don't forget that. I think it's very important to give both messages, but we do desperately need role models. And if we do not have role models, we will not produce effective, high-performing diversity. So it's middle manager's job to spot the talent and bring it on. And it took me some years, because I was a slow learner, to realise that the areas of the organisation where the middle managers would come to me and say, well, I would have promoted a woman, but none of them applied. I mean, you can't say, no, you have a year And if it still looks like this at the end of the year, frankly, I'm going to find somebody else to do this. And the areas where I left it rather long because I thought this is a very technical area. These people have huge experience, but they were running very undiverse teams. When we moved people in, and one of them went from being extremely conservative with a small c to a job share, it was transformational. We got so much better output from the area once we'd brought in people to change the culture. So it's important not to allow technical expertise to be used as a brake on producing the right leadership culture. The trade-off there is really skewed, and it's skewed towards getting the culture right.
Thank you. Please, up there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Sir Donnelly and Sue, thank you very much. My name is Sarah Emerson. I'm an executive MBA student here and formerly working in women's empowerment and conscious capitalism, so very interested in your remarks today. Thank you. My question comes down to, I guess, stereotypically, right, at a business school, back to the finances, financial statements. Two questions. One is related to making space for managers to act in a way that does follow the correct behaviors. I think it's Tony Schwartz, great author, you can search it, as far as where you get your energy from and how to create that space for a healthy work culture. What I learned from a lot of his writing is learning how to accept when your employee for the first time takes you up on your offer and says no. Right? And it happened to be with men that I was managing, but it was all the same of how did I absorb that, right? Was I going to take on that work, or was I willing to go up to the C-suite and say, actually, this is a culture that's important to me, presumably you're behind it, what do we do as a broad organization? So I guess it's a tactical question about how do we actually make that space? Presumably, if we're having our level of effort for a majority of our team, women included, but men as well, at 150, 200%, what's the impact at an organizational level and specifically to the finances of either slower productivity, et cetera? I'm belaboring the point. The second question is related to the ESG and financial reporting and the trend now with CFOs now being, unfortunately or fortunately, also not only financial people, but climate activists to a certain extent and having to report that now. And I'm wondering, are we waiting until we actually have some sort of a financial implication, such as climate change has caused, for companies to actually take all types of gender equality and inclusion seriously?
Yeah, that's a very interesting set of issues, and I wouldn't claim to have many of the answers to them. I do think, though, that on the financials, of course, you can never run the experiment twice. And again, I believe this comes back to culture. I've seen too many organizations, and not just finance-driven ones, allow dominant individuals to claim that the success is entirely due to them, to build up a court, you'd have to call it, around themselves of people, who basically reinforce these behaviors, and then they wonder why the organization crashes spectacularly, as it does tend to. So I think the best finance person I ever worked with, happened to be a man, was, in Myers-Briggs terms, an F. He was a really good people person, and he just attracted great talent because people liked working with him and he loved coaching them. And he changed the culture in finance, and finance was a highly effective area which showed hugely cooperative behaviors. And we had annual finance awards, for the people who developed most, for the teams that had, supported each other best, all those things. So I don't think that finance is fundamentally different from other areas of an organization. And I don't think that a focus on the bottom line in any more than the most ruthless short-term ways is somehow anti-diversity or needs to be. The problem is when you tolerate a macho culture, and macho can be either gender, then you don't allow yourselves the culture which allows you to go up to the C-suite and say, hey, these are our values, aren't they? So, anybody can be a leader when the sun is shining. Well, it's raining now. You're going to hold your umbrella over me while, I deal with this problem? And then the question is, and that's why it comes back to what I was discussing about, do people trust you? Do you trust your bosses? Do you know them? You've got to take a risk, just as all of you in organisations are going to have to call it the first time you see behaviour which is not consistent with the values that your organisation will undoubtedly have in the elevator, but are they being applied? And if you're not prepared to take that risk, then that organisation is already suboptimal. Now, I'm afraid my challenge to you is, we know all this stuff, it's doing it, and your job is to do it, and occasionally it will be to take risks. But managers' jobs is to make it easy for you to take the risk because you trust them.
Thank you. Please.
Right. I'm Carolyn. I'm in the MMPM program. I'm a strategy software consultant. Oh, thank you. Right. And my question is, I've read all the research and I've had the experience myself where having a women's group internal in an organization or wherever you are helps give you the confidence to then start to challenge these behaviors and start to act in a way that allows you to kind of be more high performing than you might otherwise be. But I also have had the experience that people men in particular, find that very uncomfortable. So I was wondering whether you could talk about that particular issue of having a women's group that provides that support without making the men feel uncomfortable about that.
Well, I am proud of the fact that in my latter years in the business department, we didn't have a women's group because women didn't really feel it was necessary. Then I moved to set up a new department. Back down the hill, we needed a women's group. I think there's an element of education here. I remember going to a meeting in Biz, and there were 8 of us, and 6 people were women, and there was a man from outside, from another department, who was showing slight signs of anxiety. And he said to me at the end, "Did you notice that there were 6 women in that meeting?" And I said, "Well, yeah, that's sort of quite normal around here." But it's easy to laugh, and I did a bit when you'd gone. But the question I don't quite know the answer to is, so what do we do? What sort of education do we provide? Because I think it's very important not to compromise the values. It's also equally important to help people where they are get to where they need to be. And all you have to do is, ask them to want to get there, but then you have to support them because this is a journey for people. And it's also a journey for people who've been working in what I'd call macho cultures to unlearn the wrong behaviours, and they need help. And usually, when they're sure you mean it, they feel a bit liberated because most men I know do not like pretending to have to have sharp elbows and not trust anybody and so on. So I think we do have to recognise people are at different positions. We do have to help them, but we do have to expect them, to want to be helped. And it is difficult because, frankly, there are men, and I may be one of them, who only got to where they are because the culture was how it was. But that ultimately, that's not how good organisations become really good organisations, and it's also not what we say we want. So I think, we have to expect people to live up to the values that they support, but just putting them on the elevator doesn't work. One of the best ever value statements I read was an American company called Enron. Their values were wonderful. It wasn't the values in the elevator that were the problem.
Helen.
Hi, Helen McShane, Deputy Head of Medical Sciences. I just wonder, when you introduced your culture change, whether you encountered any resistance, either from the men or from the women who behaved as men, or whether it was obvious that they were going to ultimately benefit from a more diverse environment and culture as well.
I think they wanted to know that I was serious, and I wasn't going to take them a certain way and then let them down or manipulate them. And it did require some changes in the leadership team. But basically, it required this building up of mutual trust, and doing training together made a huge difference on that. And actually, you know, doing some role plays of difficult conversations, getting physical, realizing that, and this was perhaps particularly true in the civil service, but it's not just true in the civil service, it's true in, you know, some professions. We'd been rather written and formal in our culture, and we had to, you know, be more aware of what effective communication meant and how you do it, and practicing that and then doing it together. And then, because we'd done it as a senior team, we could say to the middle management levels, who really are the challenge, if they don't buy in, frankly, you know, to say, you are going to do this training, we have done it, and you are doing it for the benefit of the people who work for you. And don't forget that. And you tell them that's why you're doing it. And when you come back, you say, you know, this is how it's going to help us communicate better. And once we'd sort of broken through that, somebody who came into the organisation, having been a senior manager elsewhere, said, but it's like leaving North Korea to go to Canada. And, you know, one example was we had a horrible IT collapse. And, you know, the team were working 24/7, and it was ghastly, and you know, everybody was getting worked up, and I think eventually the cabinet ended up discussing this problem. And we had the team in to talk to our senior managers meeting, and as they came in, everybody gave them a round of applause, because we knew how hard they'd been working. And someone said to me, you know, in Department X, they'd all have been sacked. And it was, once you build a supportive culture, of course you still have to deal with issues of performance and so on, but it's so much easier to do it because people are prepared to be more honest about what's going on, you know. And in that case, the problems were actually external to our organisation, and we were having to deal with them. But it came down to, do people trust you, and do they know you? And they have to know all the stuff that you didn't really want to tell people about before, because that wasn't what the sort of, I'm a manager because I'm tougher, smarter, and, you know, more resilient than you. No, you know. And not everybody was comfortable about that. Then the other problem outside, I found, was people were quite happy to do a bit of gender diversity. And they could see that we were keen on it, but a bit, you know, well, you do stamp collecting, you know, and I do art. But it's, people have got to buy in that this matters. And if it matters, you have to do things differently. And not everybody's prepared to do that beyond a certain point. And that's why it continues to be an effort. And that's why, you know, we are where we are today.
Thank you. Please.
I'm sure I could have made a walk further. Thank you. Fascinating. My name's Kevin Ball. I'm Vice President of Global Talent Management with a US technology firm. It's a truism of change leadership that the role of the senior leader is significant in terms of how it works. Did the change endure in the department after your leaving?
Yes, the department still has a very high proportion of senior women, but I think it's important, you know, for me to say, okay, I did stuff in my time. Life moves on, the challenges change, so how people respond change, but are the values still there? And I would say that the people who were part of this senior management change, because, you know, we had to do it together. I get to talk about it, but it wasn't me. It was us. They have all, I think pretty much without exception, found that an extremely rich period of their management time, which they continue to benefit from and draw on in other organisations. So, you know, 50% of the people it's now a different department, it has different groups, and more than 50% of the people are no longer there. So I like to think that what we did affected a generation of managers, and of course there were other people already doing this or doing it in different ways. But I think it did leave its mark, and I think it reminded people that you can seek to be a very senior manager without giving up other things that are important to you, whether it's your values, you know, your personal life, or indeed having to manage problems which might be physical or or they might be other. So I like to think it expanded the space that people could think existed.
So I hear, yes, it enjoyed with the individuals, but not necessarily with the organization.
No, I think that's too negative, but it's not for me to comment on an organisation that I'm not now in. And, you know, there are very good people running that organisation now, and, you know, I like to think, yeah, that some of what they took came from the period that I was there, other bits they've added themselves. And that's how it should be.
Thank you. What about there, please? Thank you.
My name's Serena. I work for Oxford University Innovation. I'm aware that Helen's on our board, so I'm going to be careful about what I say. One thing that we're all friends. We have quite a big board, actually, and it's diverse in some respects and not necessarily diverse in others. And I wondered if you could share any experience you have with, like, kind of evaluating a board's composition and seeing whether that needs to be changed and whether that involves like fixed terms for folk on the board or not. And yeah, just some experiences you have there would be great.
Yeah, and that's really important. And my experience was it requires constant work. This is never a finished process, because every time a board member changes, or indeed a senior team member changes, if you don't change how you work together, you are not going to be fully effective. So, you know, we all went through the Myers-Briggs process, and, you know, you could choose whatever you do, but you need to be aware of what people bring, not just or mainly in technical terms, but as what sort of people they are. Then you have to have a culture, and I think this gets harder as groups get bigger. So, you know, personally, I'd prefer to keep them 9, 10, 12, maybe. Beyond that, I think you're talking a different sort of group. But you have to be in a position where you can say, you know, X, I know you're an introvert, but, you know, sometimes you look a bit semi-detached. Would you mind coming in a little bit earlier in discussions occasionally? Or why, you know, I know your style is to sort of think out loud, but could you sort of just hold it back a bit sometimes, not be the first person to talk for the next 3 items next week? And you have to have a culture where you can say that. Or they can say to me, you know, Martin, why are we having this meeting? I don't see the point of it. You know. There's also the question of who's giving you feedback. We had observers on our senior board, and we'd get them to give us feedback, and we trusted them. But the most important thing we did was we gave each other feedback, and we'd learnt that from a coach. We had a single page of, you know, were we talking about the right things? Were the behaviours okay? Did we actually come to some sensible conclusions? Anything else? And we just take it in turns to fill out that form and take 2 minutes at the end of every meeting by ourselves just to give that feedback. And part of it was just being prepared to give feedback. And that went back to something I'd learned several years before, because I knew, taking on my leadership role, that I was very good at chairing meetings. I'd had a job when basically I'd spent 5 years chairing cabinet office meetings with lots of departments and so on. And, you know, that was one of my core skills. It turned out that I had somebody on my senior team who had a consultancy background and was Scandinavian, and she was very blunt. And she said to me, you know, Martin, we have too many meetings, and, you know, everybody thinks, why are we having this? And, you know, you go on too long. And I said, no, I don't. I'm good at this. She said, well, I'm just telling you what everybody says outside the door before we come into the meeting. So, great. So what I did was I said, okay, Tara, look, you better give me regular feedback on this. You can be my feedback person so I can do something about it. And, you know, at least she'd been prepared to do that. And I was, you know, at the stage when I realised I had to sort of learn. So by building up a culture where we could say to people, you know, actually, I found that a bit irritating, or why did you put it that way? We could do something about it. And of course, you know, some of us got on with each other better than others, but I learned that my job was actually to get the best out of them, which sounds a bit naff, but is actually what the point of being the facilitator of a group is. And occasionally I would, you know, say, look, I think we've really got to go in this direction, but they could push back. And so you need, if it's an executive group, you need to build that culture, and it requires everybody, in my experience, to compromise. So, you know, when we brought sweets in, I'd make sure I put a couple of bits of raw carrot in for the guy, you know, who was sort of running the marathons and things, because that was what he ate. And, you know, we'd have a joke about it, but it was also part of inclusion.
We have two questions at the back, one here and one there. Thank you. Please. Martin suggested we take these three together, so you've got the mic, go. And then we'll...
Is it on? Yes, okay, hi.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
All in one go. Hi. Hi, Sue. Hi, thank you, Martin. My name's Jo Flint. I work for Google and I'm based actually in Asia Pacific. I've been out of the UK for 18 years, so hopefully have a slightly different perspective on things. Specifically, at Google, we took a really big stance about 5 years ago where we put all our data online to actually communicate our position on diversity and particularly the state of the tech industry. The interesting thing is 5 years on, nothing's really changed materially within the organisation, despite taking a huge amount of systemic steps to change the way that we involve, and we actively obviously discuss a lot of these issues and sympathise and connect with many of the points you made earlier. One of the things we don't do is have quotas. And I think that it's a really, when we look at how far have we progressed, the question comes up from where were we? And so I'm really curious in terms of your observations, particularly within Europe, how have we seen those things? We certainly know on boards, quotas have helped, certainly in the UK. Do we think that this is a critical enabler within the systems to really move things faster and hopefully progress faster?
One here, and then we can just get the three up, in fairness. Yep, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Aram Ote. I'm executive in residence at Said. I spent most of my career in development banking, working for the World Bank and other MDBs, and I think that the nature of the business is such that we recognize the value of diversity and gender diversity. You're not going to be able to do development if you don't understand the people that you serve. There are two questions I have. The first one is around data. There's been a lot of, a few discussions about the value of diversity in terms of performance. And there's enough data, but I don't feel that people have embraced that data. Is it that there's resistance to the data, or is it that people are not comfortable with the data, or is it that we're making up the data? So that's my first question. I don't think we're making up the data, I'm just being controversial. The second question is really around where society is today. My sense is that because of the populism and some of the leadership we've seen on issues like gender, that we've actually moved back as a society globally. The second part of my question relates to, I've never been a man, so I don't know how men feel about these issues. How do you make sure that men feel comfortable and they're on board with this idea of gender diversity? Because I feel that there is some anxiety with many men who wonder about, what does it mean for me? Is there reverse discrimination? Thank you.
Okay, so in fairness, I think you had your hand up, which will be the last question. Yeah, just no, I think it's the lady there actually. Thank you. Yeah. And then I think we'll pause and you'll give you a chance to answer these. I think 3/4 questions. Right. Yep. One question, please.
Great. My name's Lakshmi and I'm a junior doctor who's worked in a number of hospitals. I find your talk very relevant to the culture and leadership in hospitals and the healthcare system in general. Many of the senior staff and management are men, and these are high stress and time poor and resource poor settings. My question relates to your comments about leadership being flexible and decisions being made to allow staff to make time for personal circumstances and reduced work hours and flexibility. Can you speak to the practicality of these in resource limited, high stake environments?
Great. Really good questions. Thank you.
Over to you, Martin. Good luck.
Okay. Starting from the top. Yeah. Online data, it's interesting, isn't it? Data is necessary but not sufficient. I think, that's what we have to understand. I don't like the idea of quotas because I think it lets people off the hook in accepting that we're doing this because it is more efficient as well as more fair. I think targets are a good idea, but I used to say we don't have a target of 50% women. I'm very happy to have 60% women if that's how the effective organisation works out. What's the problem? I did have a problem with an organisation I was on the board of not so long ago, where they said, we've got this 4-year plan for diversity. And I looked at it and I said, so you're telling me that your plan is in 4 years, you want 61% of the top jobs to be done by men? They said, no, it says 39% women. They were sort of not very good on math. But, that was a terrible plan. You're actually saying we don't really think that this works. How can that be right? And of course, you've got to get there incrementally. But, I think we mustn't let targets or quotas become a distraction. But there should be social pressure on you not to miss targets, and also not to fill targets so women are only doing the supporting roles. That is not correct or efficient. And I know it's not necessary. You just have to work differently, which comes to the fourth point. I mean, that really good point about what happens if you're a junior doctor or in a medical or crisis profession. We had that in a small way with private officers and ministers who require instant support and so on. And I would say to people, you do peaks and troughs. You may need to work through a peak in your team. It doesn't have to be you personally. It should be someone. But then you have to have time off. Because we all know that if we work at a high stress level, over time our efficiency falls off. This is basic. So that's not how good organisations work. We also know we may have to be flexible if there's a crisis. And between us, we have to make sure we're covering it. That's part of the deal. But then the people who covered it also get time to recover. Now, it's easy to say that. It's a bit more complicated to do it. But I do not believe there are any areas where it cannot be done. And it comes down to having that level of supportive team and making sure you can call on the resource, if necessary, from elsewhere, because everybody buys into the fact that we can't just leave you to handle this by yourself. I think the point about, data and value, there is a value judgment on data, isn't there? We have to care about it. We have to think that it's important, what it's telling us. And people can argue about how much data you need, and there's always more you can get, and you can always interpret it in different ways. But we should not let data get in the way of doing what we have sufficient evidence for, but we should go on collecting the evidence. And I think on gender pay, actually, it's helpful, but it's not enough, as we know, by ourselves. Making men feel comfortable, that is a really difficult problem. I didn't like reading all of the stuff that said that the chief executives with daughters were the ones who got this most, because it shouldn't be like that. And I like to think if I didn't have daughters, I still feel this way, but I do. We were still working when I left the business department with the problem that women who had come back to work with small children, people would support them and they could say, I'm really exhausted, had a terrible night last night or whatever, fine. Of course you did. But the men in that situation, whose partners were having children, did not feel they could say that. Because, you just get on with it, don't you? Well, this is not sensible, but it's a reminder that we're still fighting a culture which does put pressure on men to behave in a certain way. And frankly, the older you are, the more you've lived through that culture. But it also applies in quite a lot of areas to younger men too, and we have to recognise that, and we have to help them, but we also have to say, but that's not how we do things here. So I think we've got to be open, and we need to educate and support people and give them mentors, men as well as women, but we also have to recognise that most of the problem is still in how we deal with women in organisations as they go up the hierarchy.
Very good. Okay, so thank you very much indeed. That's a really wonderful and thoughtful talk, giving us lots of things to think about in a practical way as well. The questions were fantastic. I hope you can stay for some drinks, and we're going to have another one of these seminars in the final term before the summer. So we look forward to seeing you again. Martin, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.